As a sophomore in college, there's one set route I take to get to and from my classes. I live with my father and sister still. I couldn't afford to move out into one of the dormitories, but the drive over is scenic, so I've never been upset by it. There's one stretch of the route, however, Mount Pisgah Road. Something about it is odd, and the reason for it is kind of beyond me. It's a stretch of road towards the middle of my route, just before the old church and just after a highway that connects to a gas station. It's a place I would have expected to get some traffic, but for the multiple semesters I've driven past it, I've never seen a single car. The road itself is no oddity either. It's not rough gravel, it's neatly paved asphalt, and from the look of the map of the area, it leads into plenty of other roads. Lined along the stretch of it were suburbs with neatly trimmed, almost unnaturally solid green lawns. Cookie-cutter houses with pristine white paint and charcoal gray shingled roofs. Each was lined with expertly clipped bushes. Each had 2 stories and indoor garages, and all of which looked to be like the pinnacle of modern suburbia. Not a blade of grass is overgrown here, not a single stone out of place. Expensive cars, the make and models of which I can never recognize as anything more than newer, sat out in front of each house. But I've never seen any people driving through Mount Pisgah Road. Some of my classes have me driving through the area in the early morning, others in the afternoon, others in the evening, and not once have I seen anyone in the driveway. No adult leaving for or coming back from jobs, no kids gone off to school. The more I think about it, the more closely I look at the road anytime I drive through it. I spent quite a few trips squinting at the mailboxes, trying to read the numbers on them, but they didn't seem to be there either. There was one thing I noticed. I didn't pick up on it straight away, but after so long of driving through the road, I'd noticed a subtle change in the air whenever I turned onto it. It was like the atmosphere was ever so slightly different here. The weather was always consistently overcast, but bright too. An eerily perfect outdoor set, but with no actors. Odd road aside, my semester continued as normal. The work was challenging enough. My pursuit of a criminal justice degree gave me plenty of classes I was interested in too. It was about a week before our midterm exams were scheduled. I was headed home from class for a day when my car made a concerning sound. A pop, then a hiss. I could feel what it was immediately. The back right tire had blown. I put my hazard lights on and looked around the road I was about to turn onto to see if there were any places I could pull into to fix it. I was lucky that I had a spare tire on hand, even luckier still that my dad had taught me how to change them some time ago. It wasn't long into my drive and I'd just gotten off the highway. The closest place I could stop was on Mount Pisgah Road. I couldn't see anyone in the driveways as usual, so I settled for pulling into one of them. I hoped I wouldn't have any run-ins with the residents, but changing the tire really wouldn't take that long. The transition from the asphalt road to the smoother concrete driveway was hardly appreciated by my car, as I prayed I could at least get it in without any issues. Miraculously, I managed to avoid the neatly trimmed shrubbery right at the edge of the driveway. I turned my car off and got straight to work. Even if I hadn't been stranded in a stranger's driveway, I didn't want to be stuck outside doing this for very long. By the time I popped up in my trunk to get my car jack and spare tire, I realized something felt odd. Before I crouched down beside my blown tire, I cast my gaze around the suburbs of Mount Pisgah. There was still no one around. That much was abundantly clear, but there was some odd quality to the air, just like there was whenever I drove through the place. But it was stronger now. It almost felt like I was driving up a mountain, and pressure was building in my ears. I hurried up to replace my tire, kneeling down against the smooth pavement and working as quickly as what was safe. Once my busted tire was situated in the trunk of the car along with my gear, I shut the thing up and moved back to the driver's side. I cast a suspicious eye around the neighborhood. It was still completely devoid of life. I couldn't remember hearing a single car drive past either. I started to feel uneasy as I hurried to my car. While I cranked the engine, I idly looked at the house in front of me. It was as pristine as it was from a distance. I couldn't spot a single fleck of dust or dirt anywhere on the outside of the house, and there were no decorations on the lawn or front door. I looked to the windows, but every single one of them, on the first floor, had curtains drawn tightly from the inside. The second story was much the same, but in the leftmost window, for just a brief second, I saw a flash of movement, like someone peeking out at me from behind them. I backed out of the driveway pretty quickly after that, and turned back out on the Mount Pisgah Road. Full-on apprehension replaced my uneasiness even long after I'd left the road behind. That feeling like I was going up a mountain had dispelled slowly, but it still didn't feel like I was at the altitude I was used to. When I arrived home, this feeling didn't dissipate. I noticed my dad in the living room, but the car in the driveway wasn't his. Not that I recognized, at least. It was a far newer vehicle, and my sister's car wasn't in the driveway. even though she was usually home this time of day. "Did you just get a new car?" I asked him. "You didn't tell me about that." He had some book pried open in front of his face, but he lowered it when he turned his head to look at me. He smiled first, slowly, then carefully spoke. "Ah, yes, it is quite a beauty, yes? You ask me because you are quite fond of it, yes?" My dad's never talked like this before, but I was willing to chalk it up to some weird old person thing, if only for the moment. Yeah, sure. I've got homework." His eyes never take themselves off me. I shuffled to my room quickly and shut the door behind me. I tried to take my mind off of it for the rest of the night, busying myself with work from my classes. At some point, I stopped to make myself dinner, and my father was still there, like he was before. The same book was in his hands, but I could have sworn it hadn't been flipped by a single page. I ignored it, but when I went to the kitchen, I felt his eyes on my back the whole time. I brought my meager dinner back with me to my room and kept an ear out for him for the rest of the night. I'm not sure if he ever went to make food for himself, and my sister didn't return home that night. The next day, it was an evening on the weekend. I asked my dad about if she'd gone off to stay the night at a friend's or something after I'd come back from work. He was in the kitchen this time, looking through the cabinets. "Sister, what is it you mean?" His voice carried that same carefulness as before. No, not quite carefulness. He was considering his words, sure, but it almost came off to me as the same way a non-native speaker would handle an unfamiliar language. I was befuddled. "I mean Sarah, my sister. Your daughter?" "Oh, I'm afraid I do not know what you mean. There is no Sarah." "What?" My confusion crossed the line into something deeper. I turned back into the living room and looked around the walls at the framed photographs we kept up of our family, but not a single one had Sarah in it anymore. Where the photos of me and my father and Sarah had been were replaced by photos of other family members, or I thought that's what they were at first, but the harder I looked at them, the less I recognized their faces. My father walked back into the living room to stand beside me. His face didn't mimic nearly enough concern for the moment. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked. My eyes stayed glued to the pictures. I didn't say anything for a long moment. How could this be possible? Not only Sarah being wiped from the family photos, but all these people I didn't recognize. It was like I'd found myself in a different world, a different life almost, certainly not my own. That sounded crazy. Even if it was true, I needed to be alone. I didn't trust what my eyes were seeing or what my ears were hearing. I looked at my father, standing beside me, and shook my head. "Yeah, sorry, I'm fine, just tired. I need to go lay down." He let me be, but off in my room I entered a state of confusion and fear potent enough to rival when man first discovered fire. I spent a large part of the night on my laptop, looking through old photos. I never made a habit of saving ones of my family members, but I was sure I had a few lying around. It took nothing short of a sleuth because of how unorganized it all was, but just when I had been about to give up, I found it. An old photo dated from August, nearly 2 years ago. We had gone to a festival or something, I hardly remember, but we'd taken a picture in front of this big old Ferris wheel. We were all smiling, me, my father, and Sarah. I looked at my surroundings a little more suspiciously now. My room was about the same as it always was. Nothing in the house had seemed too different, save for the pictures and my father's odd behavior. A prank? Some poorly executed joke? Was that what this was? Maybe I'd just been in my head about it a little too much. That was what this had to be. But it was late, so I put off the probably non-issue until the next day. I had classes I didn't want to be sleep-deprived for anyways. Sleep didn't come so easy with a brain that still ran miles a minute, but it did come eventually. That was enough. And I promised myself that, in the morning, all would be well. On the drive to the college, I crossed Mount Pisgah Road again, but I didn't feel that same change in the air like I always did. When I arrived at my first class of the day, something immediately felt off. The professor came in, and I had to ask myself if I was in the right class. She looked like my professor, an older woman with shoulder-length silver hair, but more like a twin or something. Her features were ever so slightly different, a slimmer nose maybe, or higher cheekbones. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I couldn't focus on the lesson she gave because of it. Instead, I subtly looked around at my classmates. There was something not quite right about them either. I had never been friends with most of them, but we'd been paired up into groups enough times for me to at least recognize their faces. They all still fit a general description. Guy with short black hair, girl with long blonde hair, but It was almost like all the finer details had gotten muddled. I stopped looking so hard at one of them when they noticed I was staring. When she met my eye, she didn't stop looking at me, even after I pretended to start focusing on the lecture. I felt her gaze burn into my temple for what felt like forever. It almost felt suspicious of me. My other two classes of the day were eerily similar in nature. There wasn't one face I felt hadn't been shuffled around. They were like paid actors mimicking the people I'd known in real life. Even some of their mannerisms, the way one reached for a pencil, and the way one pulled a journal out of his bag, it felt oddly unnatural, like a bad actor trying to replicate something they'd seen on television. And when I'd finally thought to actually try to focus on my last lecture of the day, I couldn't make sense of it. The words rolled off the tongue of this supposed professor in a jilted way, like he was only repeating a shuffled variety of words he'd heard before. I thought back to Mount Pisgah Road, and that feeling in the air that always surrounded it, and about how that same feeling had remained with me ever since I'd had to stop there to change my tire. Like some parasite had latched onto me there and never let go. After my last class, I walked back to my car and looked up at the clouds. It was completely overcast, but still bright enough for me to wish I'd had my sunglasses. When I drove back through Mount Pisgah Road on the way back home, there were people in the driveways, mowing their lawns, cars on the road all around me. It was full of life now. For the rest of the day, I stayed in my room, trying to make sense of it all. The pictures on the wall were still different, and there was still no sign of Sarah. My supposed father was still acting strange, maybe even stranger than yesterday. Before I'd shut myself in my room, he'd been in the hallway, hanging up more pictures of people I didn't recognize. The way he looked at me now was scrutinizing, like I was somehow the one hiding something from him. I knew he wasn't my father anymore. He was just something adjacent to him. To anyone else, he could pass as my old man at a quick glance, but anything more in depth gave him away. I didn't talk to him for the rest of the night, but in the morning when I came out to get to my classes, he was waiting for me by the door. "I know," he began. "You do not belong here." I held my backpack against me a little tighter. I said nothing and stared at the stranger. "You are not like us," it continued, "but it will not be that way for long." I remained wordless, trying to keep the wreckage of my explosive fear out of my eyes. Luckily, the thing imitating my father moved away from the front door, and I was able to leave without anything more sinister happening. The implications of its words rang in my head the full length of the drive to the college. I didn't feel safe, not even after I'd settled myself into my classes, and it felt suddenly like everyone's eyes were on me. They were not the odd ones out here in this world, I was. I didn't sit through all my classes. After the first one was over, I couldn't take it anymore. With no safer place I knew to go, I made my way back home. But when I turned into the driveway, alongside my dad's pristine new car was another one, parked in the same spot I always pulled into. I knew it was for me. A feeling of deep unease overcame me. This was one step too far for me. I pulled right back out of the driveway and back onto the road. This wasn't familiar, this world. None of it was. "You do not belong here." It repeated in my head over and over again, crowding out anything else. I couldn't think straight, and every car that passed me seemed to know it. I drove long and far past perfect suburbs in the downtown area and a school and strip mall. I didn't stop once. I didn't intend to, until a pair of blue lights started flashing angrily behind me. Shit. A church's empty parking lot was just ahead of us, so I pulled into it carefully. Not into any of the parking spots, but to the side just enough so that the officer's car could pull in behind me. I could have sworn I hadn't been speeding, but my mind had just been on anything else. I had no way to know for sure. This is not what I needed right now, but I feared what would happen if I didn't comply. I put my car in park and watched the officer's car pull in behind me. The glare of the flashing lights made it nearly impossible to see the man leave his car and approach me from the rearview mirror. I rolled down my window slowly as the figure came closer. It wasn't much of a surprise to me when I saw the face of a man I did not recognize. But when he stopped to stand in front of me and didn't say a word, unease rolled through me in waves. I cleared my throat. Good afternoon, sir. What seems to be the problem?" I could explain myself well enough, I thought, if only the guy would say something, but instead he stared at me for a long, hard while. My composure threatened to crumble under my internal panic. He remained stoic for longer than what I nearly thought I could bear, but finally he spoke. It was in a low, almost accusatory tone. "You don't belong here." What I was supposed to say to that I did not know. All I did know was something bad was about to happen. I could feel it in the lightning fear that jolted through me. The officer stood as if waiting for me to respond to that, but instead I made a snap decision. I yanked my car back into drive and slammed my foot down on the pedal, pulling the steering wheel hard to one side and just barely missing the side of the officer's car as I fled to the road I'd come from. My eyes switched from the road to my rear-view mirror like a madman. The officer hadn't moved where he stood, except to stare directly at me as I fled the scene. I drove as far away as I could manage after that, paranoid of every car I drove past up until the sun dipped below the distant tree line. I couldn't go back home, and the idea of renting a motel room was way too risky to me. I needed to keep alone for my own safety. I needed to find my sister. I needed to get away from this world full of these not quite people. My car came to a stop in a secluded lot wedged between a stretch of woods away from any suburbs or stores. I hoped it was enough to keep me safe. I hoped nothing would find me here, at least for enough time for me to rest and get my bearings. There was a hope, a small inkling in my head of how I could possibly make things right. It was a stretch, but this world, this situation I'd found myself in hardly felt real. This was the only solution to it that I could possibly think of. I had to go back to Mount Pisgah Road.